She slid 5 crumpled dollar bills across the kitchen counter like she was leaving a tip for a waitress she'd already decided not to come back to. She looked me dead in the eyes and said, with the kind of calm that only comes from years of practiced cruelty, "That should cover groceries. I'm sure you'll figure it out." I stood there, holding those 5 bills in my hand, staring at them the way you stare at something that cannot possibly be real. A spider on the ceiling above your pillow, a crack running through a wall you painted just last month. And then, as if she'd already forgotten the whole exchange, she turned to her son, my husband, and said, "Make sure there's meat on the table tonight, sweetheart. You know how you get when you don't eat properly." Jason nodded. He actually nodded. He didn't look at me. He didn't say a word. He just nodded at his mother and walked out of the kitchen. And I stood there alone with $5 and the distant understanding that the life I thought I had built was nothing more than a stage set, painted plywood and borrowed light. Let me take you back, because none of this happened overnight, and you deserve to understand exactly how a person ends up standing in their own kitchen, holding $5 and feeling like a stranger in their own home. When Jason and I got married, I was 28 years old and convinced that I had done everything right. I had a job I was proud of. I managed accounts at a mid-sized marketing firm downtown. Not glamorous, but steady and growing. I had savings. I had a small apartment that I'd furnished slowly and carefully over 3 years, piece by piece, each item chosen because I loved it, not because it was on sale. I had a life that felt like mine. And then I had Jason, who walked into my world with warm eyes and a laugh that started somewhere deep in his chest, and I genuinely thought, this is the person I've been building a life for. We got married on a Saturday in October, outdoor ceremony, leaves turning gold and amber in the park behind the venue. My mother cried. My best friend Allie caught the bouquet and pretended to be annoyed. Jason's mother Carol stood in the front row in a cream-colored dress, a choice that made Allie raise an eyebrow behind her champagne glass, and smiled at everyone with teeth that were just a little too bright and eyes that were just a little too still. Our apartment was on the 4th floor of a building on Maple Street, a tree-lined block that smelled like cut grass in summer and wood smoke in autumn. The kitchen had big windows that let in the morning light at an angle I'd learned to love, the way it fell across the white tile and the wooden chopping board and the small pot of basil I kept on the windowsill. I cooked in the evenings, not elaborate meals, but good ones. Pasta with a slow-cooked tomato sauce, roasted chicken with garlic and lemon, soup on Sunday evenings from whatever was left in the fridge. Jason would sit at the kitchen island with a glass of wine and tell me about his day at work, and I would stir and listen, and it felt uncomplicated and good. It felt like the version of marriage I had imagined when I was a teenager, lying on my bed with a book, half dreaming about the future. Carol lived 40 minutes away, in the house where Jason had grown up. A large, slightly over-furnished colonial with a garden full of roses she tended with the same precision she brought to everything. She was 61, recently widowed, and she had opinions about everything. The way vegetables should be stored, the correct thread count for sheets, the inherent superiority of cooking with real butter rather than olive oil. In those early months, I told myself these opinions were harmless. I told myself she was lonely and adjusting, and that underneath the commentary there was a woman who simply wanted to be close to her son. I was patient. I smiled at her observations. I asked for her recipes. I called her Carol, not Mom, a boundary she noted once, quietly, with a small compression of her lips that I filed away and forgot. The first time something felt wrong, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. It was a Sunday in January, about 4 months into our marriage. Jason and I had just come back from the farmer's market. Bright, cold morning, paper cups of coffee, the smell of bread from the bakery stall. And we'd bought a whole chicken, some winter vegetables, a block of good cheese. I was in a good mood. I was unpacking everything onto the kitchen counter, talking about what I wanted to make for dinner, when my phone buzzed with a text from Carol. "Thinking of coming over this afternoon if that's all right. Miss my boy." I showed it to Jason and he said, "Sure, of course," without asking me, without even pausing, and I told myself it was fine and went back to unpacking the groceries. Carol arrived at 2 o'clock in a wool coat the color of charcoal, carrying a tin of shortbread cookies and a look that said she was doing us an enormous favor by visiting. She sat at the kitchen island, my kitchen island, with her hands folded on top of each other and watched me move around the kitchen with an expression I can only describe as the kind of quiet, relentless appraisal that livestock gets at auction. She complimented the apartment in a tone that suggested it fell just slightly short of what she would have chosen. She asked about my job with a smile that stopped at her cheekbones. And then, about an hour in, while Jason was in the other room, she leaned forward across the counter and said, in a voice like a hand pressing gently on a bruise, "I worry about Jason, you know. He's always needed someone to really take care of him. His father and I always made sure the house ran properly. A man needs to come home to order, to good food, to stability." She let the word stability settle in the air between us. Then she smiled and picked up her coffee cup and said nothing else. And I stood there with a wooden spoon in my hand, wondering if I had just been insulted or if I was being oversensitive, the way women are always told they are when someone says something that lands exactly like a blade. I didn't tell Jason about it. I wasn't sure what to say. I wasn't even sure, fully, that there was anything to say. I put it in a small box at the back of my mind and went back to making dinner. The visits became more frequent through February and March. Carol would appear on Sunday afternoons and sometimes Saturday mornings, always with a tin of something or a casserole dish covered in foil, as though our kitchen were inadequate for the task of feeding her son without her intervention. She started making small adjustments when I wasn't looking, reorganizing the spice rack, moving the dish towels to a different drawer, replacing my good olive oil with a brand she preferred because it was more economical. Sweetheart, no need to spend like that when this one is perfectly fine. I would notice the changes and feel something small and sharp move through my chest. But every time I tried to say something to Jason about it, he would tilt his head with a look of gentle exasperation and say, "She means well, Sarah. She's just trying to help. You know how she is." And I did know how she was. That was beginning to be the problem. The money started in April. I want to be precise about this because the precision matters. It wasn't a sudden thing. It was gradual, incremental, the kind of shift that happens so slowly you're halfway through it before you realize you've moved at all. It started with Carol offering to contribute to the household. She said it like it was a gift, like she was being generous. Jason had mentioned, and I still don't know when or why this conversation happened without me, that we were saving to build up an emergency fund, that money was a little tighter since we'd started putting extra away for a down payment on a house. Carol had heard this and decided, apparently, that the solution was for her to be involved. "I want to help with groceries," she said one Sunday, pressing an envelope across the table. "Families take care of each other. That's what we do." I looked at Jason. He was nodding with the expression of a man who believes something is being settled when it is in fact only beginning. I opened the envelope. There were $80 inside. I said, "Thank you." I thought the matter was closed. It wasn't closed. Over the following weeks, Carol's financial contribution came with an expanding list of requirements. There should be fresh vegetables. There should be proper meals, not takeout every night. That stuff is terrible for you. The meals should be cooked from scratch. And there should, Carol specified with the confidence of someone announcing a law rather than a preference, always be meat on the table. Jason ate meat at every dinner. This was important to her. This was non-negotiable. I kept cooking. I was already cooking. I didn't need the $80 and I didn't need the instructions. But I took both and said nothing and told myself that this was a season, that it would pass, that learning to manage Carol was part of learning to be married. I was good at managing difficult things. I had been doing it my whole adult life. By May, the envelope on the Sunday table contained $60. By June, it was $40. I noticed. Of course I noticed. I said something to Jason in bed one night, quietly, not wanting it to be a fight, just wanting to name the thing I was seeing. "Your mom keeps bringing less each week," I said, "but she keeps asking for the same things. It doesn't quite balance." Jason was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She's on a fixed income, Sarah. She's doing what she can." I looked at the ceiling. The streetlight came through the curtain in a thin orange line. I thought about the wool coat, the cream-colored wedding dress, the rose garden in the back of a house worth well over $400,000. But I said nothing more and closed my eyes and went to sleep, because I was still, at that point, committed to the belief that I was misreading things, that I was, as I had been warned many times in many quiet moments, being too sensitive. The morning everything broke open was a Tuesday in July, and it began, as so many catastrophic things do, with something completely ordinary. I was running slightly late for work, moving through the kitchen with my bag over one shoulder and a cup of coffee in my hand. And Carol had come over the night before and was still there. She had started doing that, staying over on Monday nights, because the drive back is just so long and I get so tired. Jason, you know how I am. And she was sitting at my kitchen island with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, watching me the way she always watched me, with that precise, measuring stillness. She waited until I set my coffee cup down to look for my keys, and then she slid something across the counter. $5. A $5 bill, soft at the edges from having been folded and refolded, pressed flat against my white tile counter. I looked at it. I looked at her. She said, "That should cover groceries for the month. I'm sure you'll figure it out." I want to tell you that I said something powerful in that moment. I want to tell you that I stood up straight and looked her in the eye and laid down exactly what I thought. But the truth is that I just stared at her. And then I stared at the $5 bill. And then I picked it up because my hands needed something to do. And then Jason walked in from the hallway, still buttoning his shirt cuffs. And Carol looked at him with the particular warmth she reserved exclusively for her son and said, "Make sure there's meat on the table tonight, sweetheart. You know how you get when you don't eat properly." And Jason nodded. He nodded like she'd said something completely reasonable, like the geometry of what had just happened. $5, a month, meat every night, was not absurd to him, was not the unraveling of something fundamental, was just his mother being his mother, and the world continuing to turn on its axis. I left for work. I sat in the subway car with the $5 bill still in my hand and felt, for the first time, something I hadn't felt in our apartment before. The cold, clear understanding that I had been very slowly, very carefully, backed into a corner by someone who had been planning it for a long time, and that the person I had married had been watching it happen and saying nothing. The office that morning was bright and loud and full of the ordinary noise of people having ordinary problems. And I sat at my desk and opened my laptop and stared at the screen without seeing any of it. My colleague Dana asked twice if I was all right. I said yes, both times. I went to the bathroom at 11 o'clock and stood at the sink and looked at myself in the mirror for a long time, long enough for 2 people to come in and leave again, and thought about the spice rack rearranged without my permission, and the olive oil replaced, and the $80 becoming $60, becoming $40, becoming $5. I thought about the way Carol said the word stability. I thought about Jason's nod. I thought about meat on the table every night. I called Allie at noon. She answered on the second ring, and I told her everything. And by the end of it, my voice was doing the thing it does when I'm trying very hard not to cry. High and careful, like I'm carrying something fragile across a room. Allie didn't say anything for a moment after I finished, and then she said, very quietly, "Sarah, this isn't about groceries." I knew she was right. I had known it since the subway car. But hearing it said out loud in Allie's flat, factual voice, the voice she used when she was being honest instead of kind, made it real in a way it hadn't been yet. I pressed my thumb against the edge of my desk until it hurt, and I said, "I know." "You need to find out what she actually wants," Allie said, "because this is a woman with a plan, and whatever the plan is, Jason already knows about it." I didn't want to believe that last part. I drove home that evening with the windows down and the radio on, and I told myself there were 100 explanations. that Jason was passive and conflict avoidant and had never learned to push back against his mother, but that this was different from conspiracy, that there was a gap between weakness and betrayal. I told myself I would talk to him that evening, calmly, clearly, that we would sit down together and I would explain how the morning had made me feel, and he would listen and something would shift. Some gear in the machinery of our marriage would catch and turn, and we would be okay. I came home to the smell of Carol's perfume, heavy, floral, the kind that announces itself in a room 10 minutes before you enter it, and the sound of the television from the living room, and I dropped my bag on the hallway chair and walked into the kitchen to start dinner, because apparently I was still going to make dinner, because apparently $5 and a demand for meat and a husband's complicit nod were not enough to stop me from standing at that stove and making something from scratch. And I stood at the counter for a moment with both hands flat against the tile, breathing. That was when I saw it. There was a manila envelope on the kitchen table. Carol's handwriting on the front, neat, upright letters, the kind you learn in schools that still believed in penmanship. It was addressed to Jason. It was open. And it had been left there, I understood, with a kind of slow, terrible clarity, where I would see it. Not hidden, not concealed. Left in plain sight on my kitchen table like something that needed no concealing, like the confidence of a person who has already won. My hands were not shaking yet. That came later. In that moment, I was very still, the way you are when your body understands something before your mind does and decides that the right response is stillness, like an animal in tall grass. I crossed the kitchen. I picked up the envelope. I pulled out the papers inside and unfolded them against the table, smoothing the crease down the center with my thumb, and I read. The papers were 3 pages long. The first page was a letter, typed, not handwritten, which told me something important about the level of preparation involved. It was addressed to Jason from Carol, and it opened with the phrase, "as we discussed," which hit me somewhere behind the sternum with the force of a closed fist. Those 3 words meant there had been a real discussion, deliberate, held in some room I was not in, between 2 people who had stood in front of me and smiled and said things like, "We're family," and "whatever you think is best, sweetheart." I made myself read slowly. The letter laid out what Carol called a family financial restructuring plan. The language was almost corporate, dry, precise, bloodless. And I remember thinking, even in that moment of cold horror, that someone had helped her write it. The plan was straightforward in its brutality. Our lease was up in September. Rather than renew, Carol proposed, as we discussed, that we move into her house. Not as guests, permanently. The letter described our current living situation, my apartment, my kitchen, my basil plant on the windowsill, as a temporary arrangement that has not served the family's long-term interests. I put the first page down. My hands were still steady. The second page was worse. It was a financial summary, a breakdown of our combined monthly income, Jason's salary and mine listed separately, which meant Carol knew exactly what I earned, down to the last dollar. Jason had told her. My husband had sat across from his mother and enumerated my income like it was a household asset available for reallocation. The proposed budget showed a line for Carol's household maintenance, $800, a line for Jason's personal expenses, $400. There was no line for my personal expenses, not a single one. The math left me with approximately $35 per month for anything that was not Carol's house or Jason's comfort, provided, of course, there was meat on the table every night. The third page was the one that dissolved the last solid thing I had been standing on. It was a printed email exchange between Jason and Carol, dated 6 weeks earlier. His messages were short, almost telegraphic, the way people write when they are ashamed and want to leave as little evidence as possible. Carol's were longer, confident, the messages of someone who has already decided. In the third email down, Carol had written, "She won't push back if we move slowly. She never does. That's her weakness. She's a peacekeeper. By the time she understands what's happened, it will already be done." Jason had replied 3 minutes later, "I know, I'll handle the lease." I read that exchange 3 times. She never does. That's her weakness. I read it until the words stopped meaning anything individually and became just shapes on a page. Then I folded all 3 pages exactly as I'd found them, placed them back in the envelope, and stood at the kitchen table with my hands flat on the surface. I had expected the feeling of other terrible moments, the hot rush of tears, the collapse inward. Instead, what came was something quieter and more dangerous. Everything went very still. The hum of the refrigerator was suddenly the loudest sound in the apartment. Somewhere in the living room, the television was on, Carol's voice audible between shows, and Jason's lower murmur responding, comfortable, familiar, unbothered. And that sound was the thing that finally moved me, not into tears, into clarity. I picked up my phone. I texted Allie. "I need you to find me a lawyer, tonight if possible. Don't ask questions yet." I put the phone in my pocket, and then I walked into the living room. They were sitting on opposite ends of the couch, Carol with her tea and Jason with the remote. When I walked in, they both looked up with the mild, unguarded expressions of people who have no idea the ground has already shifted. I stood in the doorway and looked at Jason. His small, reflexive smile began to dissolve as he read my face. I said, "I found the letter." The silence was immediate and complete. Carol's hand stopped midway to her teacup. Jason's mouth opened slightly and then closed. I watched 4 or 5 emotions move through him in rapid succession: surprise, guilt, calculation, and then something that looked horribly, almost like relief, as if the thing he had been dreading had arrived and the dread itself was finally over. Carol recovered first. She always recovered first. She set her cup down with a small, precise click and said, in the tone of a woman explaining something to a child, "Sarah, dear, this was always meant to be a conversation. I simply wanted to put some thoughts on paper so we could discuss them properly." I didn't look at her. I kept looking at Jason. "You told her what I earn. You discussed moving us into her house. You agreed to handle the lease. And you did all of this without a single word to me." He said, "Sarah, I was going to talk to you about it." "When?" My voice was level. It scared me how level it was. "Before or after the lease expired?" Carol made a small sound, not quite a word, just a breath shaped like disapproval, and said, "I think we all just need to calm down." "Carol!" I turned to look at her then, for the first time since entering the room. "I am going to finish talking to my husband." Something moved in her eyes, a flicker of surprise, or perhaps reassessment. She pressed her lips together and said nothing more. I turned back to Jason and waited. He ran a hand through his hair. He put the remote down. He said, "She's alone in that house. It's too big for her. And I thought if I worked out the details first, then presented it as a complete plan, it would be easier than—" "Easier for who?" Silence. And in his silence, that familiar downward slide of his gaze, that practiced retreat I had once read as thoughtfulness, I felt the last scaffolding come down. Not loudly, just a quiet, final collapse, the way old structures go when they've been hollowed from the inside for long enough. I went to bed alone that night. Carol's floral perfume lingered in the hallway long after the apartment had gone quiet. I lay on my side in the dark with my phone screen lighting my face, photographed every page of the letter, sent the photos to Allie and to my own email, and lay back in the darkness and thought about Carol's phrase, "She's a peacekeeper. That's her weakness." And I thought, not anymore. The lawyer's name was Patricia Haynes. Allie had found her through a colleague. She had an office on the 14th floor downtown, a manner that was brisk without being unkind, and she read through the photographs on her screen while I watched her face. When she finished, she said, "None of this is legally binding. He can't move you anywhere. Your name is on that lease. But I want to know, have you seen any actual movement of your shared finances?" I hadn't checked. That thought hadn't occurred to me, which said something uncomfortable about how thoroughly I had been trusting a situation that had been quietly moving beneath my feet for months. Patricia gave me a list of things to verify. She said, "The best thing you can do right now is understand exactly where you stand before you have another conversation with either of them." That evening, sitting at the kitchen table with Jason in the other room, I opened the laptop and found his browser still logged into his personal savings account, the individual one we'd agreed to keep separate. He had either forgotten to close it or had not thought to. The balance was less than half what I remembered from 2 years ago. Significant amounts transferred out over 8 months, $2,000 here, $1,500 there, a lump sum of $3,000 in December while I had been busy with work deadlines and buying gifts. All the transfer descriptions were identical. Household, 8 months, running almost exactly concurrent with the escalating Sunday envelope ritual. While he'd been accepting his mother's contributions with one hand, he'd been feeding money somewhere with the other. I texted Allie. I texted Patricia. Then I sat in the dark kitchen for a long time, watching the rectangle of evening sky in the window fade from blue to gray, and I thought about what needed to happen next. The confrontation happened 3 weeks later, the time I needed to prepare. I had moved my personal savings to a new individual account. I had confirmed with our building manager that the lease renewal was mine to authorize independently since my name was primary on the agreement. I had printed the transfer records. I had written down everything, dates, amounts, specific words, in a document 4 pages long, sent to Patricia and to Allie, and to a cloud drive only I knew about. And I had asked Allie to arrive at 12:30 on Sunday. Carol arrived at noon with shortbread and a smile, doing significant heavy lifting. She talked for the first 20 minutes about her rose garden and a neighbor dispute, settling into the comfortable assumption that everything was proceeding as normal, that I was still the woman from the emails. Jason sat beside her and barely looked at me, careful and watchful, like a man navigating a room where the furniture has been shifted and he can't identify what's changed. When Allie rang the buzzer, Carol looked at the door with mild surprise. Allie came in wearing her good blazer, and I watched Carol's eyes travel over her with a quick, calibrating assessment, and understood just at the edges that something was not proceeding as expected. I opened the folder I'd placed on the counter and slid it to the center of the table. "I'd like to talk about the family financial restructuring plan," I said. The silence was extraordinary. Carol's chin lifted. Jason's hand, resting on the counter, went perfectly still. Carol said, "Where did you get that?" "You left it on my kitchen table." I held her gaze. "I read it. I photographed it. I sent it to my attorney. I've also reviewed 8 months of transfers from Jason's personal account, all labeled household. I'd like to understand which household that was." Jason stared at the folder. Carol looked at Jason. Jason looked at the table. And Carol, for the first time in the 1.5 years I had known her, did not have a response ready. She tried. "After everything I have done for this family, after I have given and supported and you gave me $5, I said, for the month, and you asked for meat on the table every night." I let that sit in the air between us for exactly as long as it deserved. That is not giving. That is a woman who decided my home and my income were resources available for her use, and who recruited my husband to help her access them. Jason flinched, small, barely visible, but Allie saw it. "I'm not asking you to leave this family," I continued, my voice still level, still cold, still mine. "I am telling you that the arrangement you planned, the one in writing, the one discussed without my knowledge, does not exist. It has never existed, and it will not exist." Carol left 40 minutes later, not storming out, she was too controlled for that, but with a compressed, cooled dignity that was its own form of retreat. She picked up her shortbread tin, said goodbye to Jason, and did not say goodbye to me. The sound of the front door closing was one of the most important sounds I had ever heard in that apartment. Jason and I talked for 3 hours. The real conversation, not performedies, but actual truth. The transfers had gone directly to Carol, deposits he'd described to himself as helping her stay afloat. He said he hadn't known the full extent of the plan until 2 months in. He said he should have told me. He said, and this at least had the texture of honesty, that he had been afraid that seeing it clearly would change things permanently. He was right. Things were changed permanently, not ended, not immediately, but changed in the way things change when you have seen the architecture of a deception and cannot unsee it. I told him what I needed: transparency, access to both accounts, a clear boundary with his mother that he would hold himself, that if Carol had genuine financial difficulties, I was willing to discuss real support, together, that the word "we" in our marriage had to mean both of us, in practice, not a public performance over a private arrangement that excluded me. One chance. I was not going to wait forever. He chose. It was slow and painful, a necessary conversation with Carol that he told me about in enough detail that I believed he'd had it. He changed the account access, canceled the transfers, told Carol that any future support would be discussed jointly. Patricia sent a formal letter documenting the financial transfers and requesting repayment. 6 weeks later, a check arrived in the mail for the full amount. There was no note. That was 9 months ago. It is autumn now, the leaves turning on Maple Street exactly as they did in the first October of our marriage. And the apartment is quieter than it used to be, and also more genuinely mine than it has ever felt. The basil plant is back on the windowsill. I replaced the olive oil. The spice rack is organized by some internal logic that makes sense only to me and that no one touches. Jason and I are still married, a work in progress, being rebuilt from an honest foundation. He goes to therapy now. We talk more directly, with less of the performed ease I now understand was always a performance. It is less comfortable. It is more real. Carol comes to dinner a few times a year. We are civil, which is all I require of her, and all I offer in return. She is not a warm presence in the room, but she is no longer a threat in it either, and I have learned that warmth and safety are not the same thing, and that I had been confusing them for a very long time. I stood on the front steps last week in the early morning, a cup of coffee in my hand, the October light low and gold and slightly melancholy. I thought about that Tuesday in July, $5 on the counter, a woman's absolute confidence in my disorientation, a husband's nod. I thought about how long I had mistaken patience for virtue and silence for grace. I thought about Carol's phrase, "She's a peacekeeper, that's her weakness," and felt something that was not quite satisfaction, but was close. The quiet, durable feeling of a person who has finally understood the difference between keeping the peace and surrendering to it. The cab arrived, I got in and went to work, and the city moved past the windows in its ordinary, relentless way. I was here. I was mine. And that was more than enough.